Hello everybody and welcome to today's lecture, which is on where is biodiversity located. In this lecture we talk about some ideas such as things like the concept of island biogeography and also what we call vicariance. We'll go into those greater detail later on, but you are going to get to learn some bits of terminology, but don't worry, it all goes through very clearly. Righty, I will just start the slides. I'm about to do this. I'll go share screen. I click that and go share. Okay, so by the end of this class, you guys should be able to describe the major patterns in terrestrial and marine species diversity across the globe, and then compare and contrast several hypotheses for explaining the major patterns in species diversity. I'm going to do this fun stuff again. Okay, so there's four processes that control species diversity in a particular location. So in the short term, so what we call in ecological time, which is ecological time is often defined as the life cycle of a single generation, so within a single animal's lifetime. There are two processes that control biodiversity. These are immigration, which is the movement of an existing species, so a species that already exists somewhere on the planet into a new area, and then emigration, which is the movement of an existing species out of an area. So one of the big examples of immigration is the colonization of islands. So does anybody know where this place is? This is the Galapagos Islands, one of the most sort of unique biodiverse places in the world. This is then the coast of Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands were never connected to the coast. So all of the animals and plants that live on the Galapagos Islands immigrated there, or at least their ancestors immigrated there. So usually they crossed 600 miles of ocean out here and they ended up on the volcanic Galapagos Islands. So this is an example of how immigration can increase species richness in a particular location. Emigration is kind of an interesting one because you might start to think about, well, why would an animal emigrate out of a certain place and the entire population emigrates such that the animal actually went extinct and therefore lowered biodiversity in the original source. And emigration for a while was a little bit controversial, but nowadays in the modern world, we are actually observing emigration of species out of particular locations due to climate change. So climate change is changing the environment really rather rapidly. And there's been an incredible study that's taken place in the UK with butterflies. So butterflies in the UK have this huge group of amateur naturalists that loves going out and observing butterflies and recording where they saw them. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. And what they've actually been able to see is in the last 30 or so years, all species of butterfly in the UK have moved northwards. In some cases, they've gone extinct in their original range and are now moving up north. Okay, so we are actually observing emigration already. The other two processes that exist on a longer time frame, so immigration and emigration occur in ecological time. There are two other processes that occur in evolutionary time, and these are speciation, so the origination of new species. The biggest example, or one of the clearest examples of this, is Darwin's finches. So we talked about how this is the, I'll just put the pointer on, actually makes life easier. Where's the, so how this area here is the Galapagos Islands. This is the coast of Ecuador, and animals and plants can cross this ocean and immigrate and colonize the islands of the Galapagos. However, when they got there, especially when this first finch got there, it's what we call speciated out. So the initial finch arrived and it ate seeds. When the finch arrived on this island, it realized there were lots of other types of, food to exploit. And what it did was the original species started to speciate out, and it produced different species that focused on buds and fruit, grubs. There was even a tool-using species, insects and leaves. So what happened was the original species came in, and then it speciated out, and this produced lots of new species, and therefore increases diversity. Conversely, we can have extinction, which is the loss of species over evolutionary time. So as a result, we've got these four different processes. We have short-term ecological processes, which are immigration that increases diversity and emigration which decreases diversity. And over the longer term, in evolutionary processes, we have speciation, which is the origination of new species, and extinction, which is the loss of species. And so you can draw them up in this sort of 2x2 little box. We have our 4 processes, 2 that take place in the short term, 2 that take place in the long term, 2 that increase diversity, and 2 that decrease diversity. And these are the basic underlying principles that determine species, the diversity of species in a particular location. When we look at globally, and we look at overall species richness pattern, we see that no matter where you look in the world, biodiversity and richness generally is highest in the tropics and lowest near the poles and intermediate in between. So this image here is the Americas. So we've got North America up here, we're about here. We have Central America, so Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, El Salvador. Then we go into South America. Now, when we look at diversity, this is this color ramp. So dark red is the highest diversity. This sort of very, very pale green is the very lowest diversity. We see the highest diversity exists here in the tropical regions. As we move out of the poles, out of the tropics towards the poles, we see diversity decreases until by the time we get to the polar regions, so Antarctica down here and the Arctic up here, we have the lowest levels of biodiversity. If we represent that graphically, on the x-axis here, we have the equator and here's the poles. So remember, this is going in both directions. So the equator means we're starting sort of here and we're going in this direction and in this direction. So this is the equator going towards the poles, equator going towards the poles, equator going towards the pole. What we see is at the equator, we have the highest species richness, and this rapidly decays as we go towards the poles. Okay? And this same pattern is observed on all the continents. The very nice thing about the Americas, and why I've used this as the example, is the Americas is the only continent where one single landmass goes in both directions towards both poles. So Africa would sit like this and then go south. Europe sits like this and then goes north. Australia sits down here and goes south. So the Americas, it goes sort of north to south all the way, and we can go tropics to poles, equator to poles in both directions. So it's important to remember, although we highlighted it in the Americas, these latitudinal patterns are repeated all across the globe. So diversity is higher in the tropics for many types of organisms. So for example, this map is showing terrestrial mammals. Red is the highest diversity. Cold colors like blue is the lowest diversity. And we can see generally we see the same patterns. Here's the equator. And we see highest diversity at the equator, lower as we go towards the poles. Highest diversity at the equator, lower as we go towards the poles. Highest diversity at the equator, lower as we go towards the poles. And then Australia is a little bit weird, but the same pattern generally holds. Okay? So we have this continual pattern whereby we have the highest diversity at the equator in the tropical regions and lowest at the poles. We also, using this, can highlight what we call hotspots. So hotspots are regions of high biodiversity. You'll often hear people in conservation talking about things like biodiversity hotspots and things like this. This is what they're referring to. These hotspots where you get really high levels of diversity. Okay. So let's just do a little quick clicker question. I've not told you the answer to this yet, so don't worry if you don't know, but it's just a thought exercise. So I just thought, why is species richness so much higher in the tropics than it is in the poles? Well, is it answer A, the tropics have consistently good growing conditions throughout the year? B, the tropics have been consistently stable throughout geological time, which means species therefore don't go extinct due to environmental fluctuations? C, the tropics are generally larger areas? Or D, all of the above? just give you 15 seconds just to think through that one. I'll have a drink of water. Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The answer is actually all of the above. One of the reasons, there are multiple hypotheses for why the tropics have higher diversity, and they're sort of encapsulated here. We're not going to go through them in depth, but just to give you the names straight away. So A, the tropics have consistently good growing conditions throughout the year. This is what's known as the productivity hypothesis. So what this means is, because the tropics are consistently very stable and they're good growing conditions, that produces a lot of resources, a lot of different species can grow there, and it increases competition. That increased competition amongst species forces them to become specialized, and so as a result, they diverge into more numbers of species. The tropics have been consistently stable through geological time. The species therefore don't go extinct due to environmental fluctuations. We call this the museum hypothesis, and it leads to reduced extinction rates. What it means is that when a species arrives in the tropics, because the conditions in those tropics have remained relatively stable, this species never faces incredibly bad ecosystem conditions that cause it to go extinct. We have lower extinction rates, therefore higher diversity. The tropics are generally larger areas. This is known as the area hypothesis, and it works on the principle that larger areas can hold more species. We're going to talk about this in great depth in one of the subsequent lectures in the theory of island biogeography. But generally, no matter where you are, there's this general pattern that's observed where in larger areas you get more species. So the answer was D, all the above. So let's go through them just a little bit. So the productivity hypothesis is basically an ecological mechanism. And the idea behind it is that we have consistent, good growing conditions observed in the tropics. They're sunny, wet, and warm, and they're in that condition most of the year. In fact, all of the year in a lot of places. And so what we get is this predictable, consistent conditions promote specialization so that species avoid competition. And we end up with many specialized but low abundant species. So let's have a look. Here we've got El Yunque in Puerto Rico. This is in the tropics. And here we have the Brooks Range in Alaska, which is very much not in the tropics. It's very far north. If we look at the species in El Yunque, Puerto Rico, we see that we've got everything is green, basically, but there's lots and lots of individuals of different species. This is because the conditions here are incredibly stable. And so the best way for a species to survive is to specialize on one particular type of habitat. So there'll be species that specialize on rocks facing in a particular direction. There'll be species that specialize in being a bit wetter, closer to the water than others. There'll be species that specialize on growing tall, and so they're able to harvest sunlight better. And then there'll be species that are designed to grow on proper hardcore bare rock that can survive in that way. As a consequence of this increased competition and specialization, we end up with an awful lot of different species, but all of them at very low abundance. If you compare that to the Brooks Range in Alaska, you end up with the opposite. Because we've got continuously fluctuating conditions, it gets very hot in the summer, relatively, and incredibly cold in the winter and completely freezes. The only species that can really survive are not species that specialize to beat competitors, but instead species that are able to cope with these crazy fluctuating conditions. And what we tend to find is we end up with landscapes where they're dominated by just one or two different species. And these species aren't great competitors, but they are able to cope with the very difficult conditions. Then we have things like the museum hypothesis. This is an evolutionary mechanism. And the idea behind this is that higher latitudes experience more disturbances, and these disturbances increase extinction rates. So one of the big examples of this was things like the Ice Age. So this is a map of the globe from 16,000 years before present, and this white area is the extent of the Arctic ice sheet during the Ice Age. So this basically means all of this area was covered by ice. Although the North Pole is predominantly iced over. It doesn't extend that far south, but during the Ice Age, the polar ice sheet came all this way down. You can still see the evidence of this. So if you go to Central Park in New York City, there are these huge rock slabs with gullies cut in them. And this is due to the ice from glaciers encroaching and grinding the rock down and wearing it smooth. So even as far as New York City, which is shown here, you can still see the evidence of a glacier advancing over what is now the city, and that's in the last ice age. We still have glaciers now. That's what they look like. They're basically a gigantic, almost frozen river. This is a glacier moving down a valley. You can see it's cut this big notch in the mountain range. Same thing happened in New York. And what happens is in the tropics, these areas here, they were never covered by this ice age. Okay, so as they've remained relatively stable. So the size of tropical zones changed due to global disturbances. So when the ice age took place, the actual size of the tropics probably shrank a little bit as it came in the way. But even during the ice age, some tropical conditions were maintained. So as a result, we had lower extinction rates in the tropics because although the size of them has changed, the tropics themselves have remained relatively stable. One of the crazy examples of this is coral. So coral, the sort of invertebrates that grow in the ocean and make these gigantic coral reefs, is well renowned as having incredibly narrow environmental conditions in which it can grow. So at the minute, in the current world, we've got lots of problems with coral bleaching due to increased temperatures in the ocean. But coral has been around for hundreds of millions of years. And it's been allowed to survive despite the fact we've had these ice ages, we've had these global heating periods, because the size of its range contracts and increases, but it remains present somewhere in the world. Okay. Also, we have the last one we'll talk about today is the area hypothesis. This is a physical or abiotic mechanism. So heat from the Earth's interior keeps the continental plates on which our land sits moving around. So if we look at this series of maps here, this is what the Earth looked like 560 million years ago. This is where the continents were allied. You can see here's North America, here's Europe, here's Asia, Australia, Antarctica, and Africa were all actually joined together. These continental plates moved so that 270 million years ago, we had the entire, all the land masses on the planet were combined together in one massive landmass called Pangaea. 150 million years ago, Pangaea is starting to split up. We now have Europe and Asia are moving away, and there's Africa and there's Antarctica. And then if we look at it today, we now have the continents arranged as they are. So even though these continents have been moving around, there have always been large land masses across the tropics for around the last 100 million years. So if we look here, it's 130 million years ago. Here is the tropical zone. It basically contains all of Africa and South America and bits of Asia. It was huge. And since larger areas can hold more species, the tropics have more species. If we look at the size of the tropics today, Africa, large part of Africa is sat in the tropics, huge part of South America and Central America, and a huge swath of Asia and the north of Australia. So we've got large land masses in the tropics. Since larger areas can hold more species, the tropics have more species. However, this won't always be the case. If the land masses continue to move as they do in 250 million years from now, so this isn't going to be a huge issue for us, but the tropics will lose large amounts of the landmass. So we'll have a little bit of Africa still in there, a big bit of South America, but Australia, North America, and all these other areas, especially Asia, will have moved right out of the tropics. In addition, there might have been very different global patterns of species richness in the past, so who knows? Now, one thing that we want to touch on, we talked a little bit there about the continents moving around on the planet. Well, this continental drift can divide species ranges. So bearing in mind, these continental, the movement of these continental plates, we're talking hundreds of millions of years in terms of amount of time. But there were species living on those plates, and some of the descendants of some of those species are alive today. So if we look at the big breakup, so at the time of the dinosaurs, and for a large time afterwards, all the continents of the world were in this area called Pangaea. So this is Pangaea here. We have Europe and Asia, what we term Eurasia here. This is Scandinavia. Here is North America. Here's Africa and South America. There's Antarctica, India, subcontinent of India, and Australia. So this one point during the time of Pangaea, all of the land masses on the planet were actually connected together. All of the land was one giant supercontinent, and the ocean was this gigantic ocean called Tethys Ocean. Then they started to break up, and the first split was what we call Laurasia and Gondwana. So the split of Laurasia and Gondwana meant we had North America and Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, in one continent of Laurasia, and South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia were joined together in a second supercontinent called Gondwana. In the modern world, they've split as we know now. So we now have South America actually now reconnected to North America by Central America. We have the Arctic, Antarctica's the way down here. We have Africa, India, and Eurasia over here. You can see in this map, they've actually highlighted where the modern continents sit inside this. There are many great clues about this still in the modern world. So for example, you can still see how South America would fit into Africa, which is kind of cool. And you can also see how Greenland, North America, and Eurasia stick together because they're shown here, okay? But as these continents have split, it's divided the range of species. And this range disruption in the distant past, so the splitting of continents, splitting species ranges, and the resulting patchy distribution today is referred to as this principle called vicariance. And vicariance is a major cause of the distinctiveness of regional biotas. By the word biota, we mean groups of animals and plants. So we can talk about the distinctive biota of Australia, or we can talk about distinctive biota of North America. So we call this vicariance-induced regionalism endemism. Okay, so if we go back to, think about when Pangaea was going and all the continents were stuck together, we now have the modern world, but different continents broke off from each other at different times. And this historic distribution of landmass in the Pangaea supercontinent explains some of the bizarre and strange distributions of animals and plants that we see today. So for example, one of the most fun of these is possums stroke opossums. So possums and opossums are a type of marsupial. These are animals that have a pouch, and their offspring are born while they're very, very poorly developed, and the offspring then crawl into the pouch and complete their development inside the pouch. So marsupials are a very sort of characteristic group of animals. And possums and opossums are now found in Australia and South America. A few actually crossed the land bridge from South America and ended up in North America, so you get them in Arizona and stuff like that. But most of the possums, or all the possums in the world, live in Australia. All of the opossums live in South America, with a few of them crossed over. So you see, you have these two very distinctive but very closely related groups of mammals, and they live on entirely different continents that are separated by the Pacific Ocean. Remember, the Pacific Ocean is the biggest ocean in the world. It covers about a third of the entire planet. So a group of animals that exists in Australia and South America and is separated by the biggest ocean in the world. How did this happen? Well, it's because possums evolved in what was Gondwana before South America and Australia split apart from each other. Antarctica was also attached at the same time, and there were possums on Antarctica. But unfortunately, when Australia, Antarctica, and South America split, Antarctica went super, super south, and all the possums died of cold, bless their hearts. But we still have them in Australia and South America. So even though they're separated by this enormous amount of ocean, because their range was once connected and now split, we now see this group of organisms in two different continents. We see this lots and lots of times. So one of the big ones that's still a bit contentious is flightless birds. Flightless birds are an amazing example. So flightless birds are the common ancestor. We've got the rhea that exists in South America, the ostrich that exists in Southern Africa, the cassowary that exists in Australia and New Guinea, the emu that exists in Australia, the kiwi that exists in New Zealand, and the moa that's extinct but also lived in New Zealand. All of these flightless birds live in the southern hemisphere. There are no large northern hemisphere flightless birds. But remember, at one point, all of these continents were connected together. So the original ancestor of all these different birds, their original common ancestor, lived on Pangaea when all these continents down here were connected. When these continents split off, members of the population of this original common ancestor were moved with the land masses onto these different continents. They then subsequently evolved, and we've ended up with this large collection of distinctive but still closely related species on a whole bunch of different continents. It's not just exclusively for animals, it happens in plants as well. So, for example, the Nothofagus group of trees, known as the southern beech, exist exclusively in Patagonia, Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. And they're a very, very distinctive type of tree. And they're also seen in fossils in Antarctica, but they don't exist anywhere else. So they only exist in these continents. Because they don't exist in Africa, it's likely that the species group had not evolved by the time Africa split off from South America and Australia, and so they were left on those two continents. So it's a really crazy principle where you can look at groups of species that we see alive today, and then we look at the tectonic movement of continents on Earth, and we can see how the splitting of these continents over time has generated these really interesting different species in different places. So the difference in the relative strength of these processes, such as the productivity hypothesis, the splitting of the tectonic plates, the area hypothesis, and the museum hypothesis, they give us our current global patterns of species. And they're related to the location of the continent and the history. So today in the modern world, there are 6 fairly distinct sets of species, and we call this the global distribution of biodiversity. So at the minute, the Ethiopian and the Oriental set appear to be joined to the Palearctic. So here we have the Palearctic, here's the Ethiopian, and here's the Oriental set. But this is a relatively recent situation. These land masses have become joined to each other. And also, deserts or high mountains still effectively keep them separate. So if we focus on the Palearctic and the Oriental plate, the Palearctic, which is a Palearctic group which is on the Eurasian plate, that looks like it should be joined to India and the subcontinent. However, on this band here are the Himalaya mountains. So as this landmass has collided with the Eurasian plate, it's formed the Himalayan mountains. They've been sent up. These have formed basically an impenetrable barrier that keeps the biota from here separate from the biota from here. Okay. And so what we can now look at, we can look at the different groups of animals and plants that we have, and we can see the sort of characteristic of different places. So for example, if we look at the North American plate, the Neo-Arctic biota, there are classic species, things like the bald eagle, the alligator, rattlesnakes, Pacific salmon, pronghorn antelopes, sequoia trees, grizzlies. All these animals and plants are characteristic of the North American biota. There are some closely related species in different places. So for example, rattlesnakes and pit vipers generally made it south, and so you do get there's like a couple of species of rattlesnake in Central America, but nothing like the diversity that we have in North America. There are some alligators here and there in other places, but nothing like the diversity we have in the North American plate. We have antelopes in other places, we have salmon in other places, we have some species of bears, but these are characteristic of the North American plate. If we look at the South American plate, we start to get some more bizarre animals. So for example, we have South America, we have sloths, the original potato, Macaws, these very large, beautifully colored parrots. Coatamundis, these things that are a bit like a very bizarre and slightly cuter raccoon. Coca plants, giant anteaters, and piranhas. All of these species are, all these groups of animals and plants are things that are unique to the neotropical South American plate. If we look at Africa, we have things like the baobab tree. Nothing like a baobab exists anywhere else in the world. The wild dogs or painted wolves. Millet, the original plant from which all of our cereals currently come from. Giant African land snails. The Lake Malawi cichlids that we talked about before. Not only do they only exist in Africa, but they only exist in one part of Africa. The okapi, one of the weirdest antelopes in the world. Hyrax, bizarrely the closest living relative of the elephant. Doesn't look much like one. It's a tiny little thing about the size of a rabbit. That's the nearest thing to an elephant. And Nile crocs. All of these characteristic of an African biota. If we go into the Oriental plate in Southern Asia, we have things like the banana, the jungle fowl, the original descendant of all chickens, Burmese pythons, one of the biggest snakes in the world, cobra. There are some species of cobra in Africa, but nothing like the diversity that you get in the Oriental plate. The orangutan, the only non-African great ape. The Indian rhino, which is very different to all the species of rhino that you observe on the African plate, and also the very famous birds of paradise. Birds of paradise are an incredibly unique group of birds that exists down here, and they are famous for having these insane feather displays and for also very specific dances and things like that. All these animals, if you just were dropped out of a spaceship and you landed in a piece of land and you saw any one of these animals, you would instantly know which biota you were looking at. If we look at Eurasia, we see there's some classics from Eurasia. Eurasia has the highest diversity of swifts anywhere in the world. We also have these really interesting ginkgos, blue tits, apples, tea, and this whole groups of sable. So a lot of the marmots, weasels, and those sort of things, they all started out in the Eurasian plate. And finally, the most bizarre is, of course, Australia. So Australia is also predominantly home to all the marsupials. The only mammals that you see in Australia that are not marsupials are bats, which have managed to fly there subsequently. But the Australian plate separated from the rest of the world before placental mammals evolved. So when Australia separated from the world, the only mammals on the planet were marsupials, were pouch mammals. Placental mammals that don't have a pouch, they have a womb. So you and I, my cat, my dog, mice, cows, sheep, all those sorts of animals, all of those are placental mammals. The vast majority of mammals on the planet are placentals. Australia is home to all the marsupials. So things like this area is home to the Tassie devil, tree kangaroos, all the wallabies, all the possums, all the bimbies, all those sorts of fun things, all come from Australia. Platypus are actually interesting because they're not even a marsupial. They're what we call a monotreme. This is a mammal that still lays eggs. So unlike marsupials, which give birth to a very poorly developed baby that then crawls into the pouch, platypus and echidna, which is another type of monotreme, they actually lay eggs. These eggs go into the pouch and then the eggs hatch in the pouch and the little baby develops in there. They're really kind of cool. Platypus are just the weirdest things on the planet. They're also poisonous. They have a venomous spine on their back leg. Weird things, but they're kind of cool. Also in Australia, we get the funnel web spider, the famous eucalypts, the kea, and a large number of parrots are based exclusively in Australia. Cockatoos and things like that. The cassowary, these things you get in far north Australia. I've only seen one of them. They're absolutely fantastic animals, but they're terrifying. They stand about 6 foot tall, and the front toe, the big toe, it doesn't really have a toe. It has a gigantic knife. The nail has grown incredibly long, and rather than having the toe per se, they have this big sort of 8-inch long knife. If they feel threatened, they will actually kick you and can disembowel people. They're pretty nasty things, but they're pretty beautiful. Also, we have other unique species of pine that exist only in Australia. So Australia has very, very characteristic and unique biota. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that although the plates have the general pattern of continental drift has meant that large land masses have fragmented into small land masses. So generally there's been a big continent that is split off into smaller ones. There is one very clear example of when the reverse has happened. So when two plates came together. And so what happens is when vicariant biotas come into contact, we get the dispersal of formerly isolated organisms. And the most clear of this is North and South America. So in geological time, South America recently ceased to be an island continent. For an awful long time, tens of millions of years, South America had broken off from Australia and Antarctica and was basically an island continent. So Australia is an island continent today. Historically, South America also used to be an island continent. So what happened was there was collisions among tectonic plates as South America and North America moved together and the Caribbean plate came into the middle. And also this created volcanic activity today, which is where Panama is and Costa Rica. So gradually the volcanic islands formed in the gap between the continents, and as the land folded and lifted, a complete bridge formed. So this is what the whole situation was 10 million years ago. We have South America going this way, the Caribbean plate coming into the middle, and North America going this way. The Caribbean plate then lodged between the North American and South American plate. What this did was it then created big tectonic events, and we got lots of volcanism. So if you go to Central America now, there's this amazing spine. So this series of volcanoes that runs right down the spine of Central America. So my favorite place for this is actually Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, the middle of the country. So Costa Rica is incredible because it's got the Atlantic Ocean / the Caribbean on one side of it, and the other side of it's got the Pacific. It's a tiny, thin country that sits between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Down the middle of the country is the spine of volcanoes that were what formed the country in the first place. It's really kind of cool. So what we have is this is the present arrangement. In this image, the black lines approximate the glacial period sea levels. So during the Ice Age, an awful lot of the water on the planet was in the polar ice caps. So as a result, sea levels were much lower. And so the black lines show you where sea level was during the Ice Age. So what we've had this situation where these this continent that was totally isolated as an island for millions of years has smashed into this other continent and a plate has moved into the middle. And so as a result, the species that were on the South American continent and the North American continent have now been able to cross this land bridge and mix. So when the land bridge was in place, the interchange of animals and plants became possible. So when North America and South America were now joined, so we had a situation where there were some northern taxa that moved into the south. So dogs, so you can now find foxes in South America, prysonids, so raccoons, camels. There were once camels in North America, and they were able to move into the south. Gomphotheres, so the most obvious ones of these that are still alive is the elephants, but things like mastodons, mammoths, all used to live in North America. They were able to cross in South America. Mustelids, the otters and things like that. Horses were able to move south. Deer were able to move south. Cats were able to move south. So the most famous, this is the cougar. The cougar originated in North America. When this land bridge was formed, it was then able to cross into South America. And at one point in its history, the cougar actually had the widest north-south range of any species in the world, because it existed all the way up to the Arctic, and it existed all the way down to southern Patagonia. So this species lived from basically pole to pole. And also some bears made it into South America. Also, some taxa moved into the north. So anteaters, we now have anteaters that colonize Central America and touch the very bottom of Mexico. Opossums, these have made it all the way up to sort of Arizona and the southern states. Some giant ground sloths made it up from South America into North America. Same with the glyptodonts and the toxodons. You might notice these are all large mammals. None of these things, unfortunately, survived the arrival of humans. We can talk about that a bit later. Also things like carvies, some of the large marsupials, and armadillos. So when these two large plates moved together, we had northern taxa that moved south and southern taxa that moved north. However, I'm going to talk about this complicated figure in a second. About the same number of mammal genera, so genera is a sort of group of species, dispersed to the north as to the south, but when they got there, their fates were very different. So here we have, on this x-axis, we have genetic diversity. This is North America, this is South America, and here's the genetic diversity. This is the time of the land bridge rising, time of the land bridge. So we're going through time here. So what happened was southern species, so here's in North America, so southern species that came into North America diversified a little bit, so we can see the genetic diversity through time increases, but they remained generally a very small part of the fauna. So this box here is the total amount of diversity. Very little of it is this grey, which is southern species that moved north. They didn't take up very much. You compare that to northern species that came into the south, they diversified dramatically in a series of steps, and over time they became the defining organism of South American fauna. So this was when the land bridge appeared. You can see this is the diversity of southern species in the north, not a very big area. This is the diversity of northern species in the south, very big area. So we had this situation where, although about the same number originally crossed back and forth across the bridge, when they got there, the southern species in the north diversified a little tiny bit. The northern species in the south diversified dramatically. So why would this be? So there's some different ideas. So for example, one of the ideas is related to temperature change. So if we start to think about, well, increased temperature after the Ice Age shrinks grassland, so our grassland becomes patchy. Grassland allows animals to move. Grasslands are very easy to move around, so grassland facilitates the movement of animals. When the grassland is patchy, the movement slows, therefore faunas become more stable. We might also have the situation of when we have decreased temperature spreads grasslands. This brings new migrants. More interactions means more evolutionary change. So we could think that the change in number of species and the difference to north and south is due to evolutionary change and movement of grasslands. But this cycle of warming and cooling also happened in North America. So if this is what's causing the sort of diversity of northern species in the south, why didn't this pattern also increase southern species moving into the north? Why didn't they also diversify there? So let's have a quick thought exercise clicker question. So why should northern species going south have done so much better than southern species going north? Is it A, species from the north were bigger and stronger? B, southern species had trouble with the climate in the north? C, southern species were competitively superior because of prior contact with other biotas? Or D, southern species were more primitive? Or E, southern species were just too bizarre in appearance to survive? Just give you 15 seconds on that. Okay, let's see what you had. Well, the current hypothesis is actually northern species were competitively superior because of prior contact with other biotas. So what do we mean by this? Well, remember, the South American plate had been an island continent for millions of years. It basically separated off from Antarctica and Australia, and it was floating about in the southern Pacific. Conversely, northern species, so species in the North American plate, had been previously exposed to other invasions. So this is the North American plate. This is the Palearctic plate, which is attached to the Eurasian plate. This area, the Bering Strait, which is between Alaska and Siberia, This was a land bridge multiple times as there were ice ages. What this meant was the biotas of Northern America and Eurasia had been mixing for an awful long time. What this meant was the animals and plants that were present on the North American plate had already evolved to be better competitors or deal with predation. Or the biotas of these two plates had actually been homogenized. So, for example, movement across the Bering Land Bridge, which is what is the Bering Sea, during ice ages homogenized Palearctic and Nearctic biotas. One of the biggest examples of this is bison. So our North American bison that we see, you can see them on Antelope Island or over in Yellowstone, our North American bison are thought to be descended from this thing, the Palearctic steppe bison, which looks like absolute nightmare fuel on the best of times. These things are about twice the size of a standard North American bison that we see today, had monstrous horns, and had come from the Palearctic plate and crossed across the Bering Sea. When they got over to North America, they subsequently evolved into our North American bison. Their descendants are still present in Siberia. There are another species of bison over there. Okay. In addition, there was even an ice-free corridor east of the Rockies. So if they crossed over into here, this sector here, east of the Rockies, so this is sort of Denver and Calgary in Canada, this ice-free corridor meant that you could get across the plate and move straight down into North America. Okay? So as a result, the species that were in North America had already been invaded multiple times and so had learned to deal with competition or were sort of incredibly well-suited species. Compare that to South America, that group, they'd been an island continent for so long, hadn't had that same mixing. Okay, so we're just going to talk a little bit about now, we've talked about the sort of global biogeography, so the species is this way. We're now going to talk about at a local level. And so it's going to be very short, but we're going to talk about the community of species at the local level. Is the community of species result due to what we call the filters concept. So if we have here the regional species pool, this is the total number of species that exist in one of our biogeographic regions. And this is a local community. So this, for example, would be all the species that exist in all of North America. Our local community would be the species that exist in Logan Canyon, if that makes sense. So we have the sort of continental scale diversity and then the species that exist in one small space. To get from here to here, you have to pass through a series of filters. So the first filter a species has to get through is the dispersal or immigration filter. And this filter weeds out any species unable to reach a specific habitat, i.e. it can't swim, fly, disperse seeds, etc. So if you live in one place, but you are unable to, for example, cross a mountain range, cross a river, move through an area of desert, if you're unable to cross into this habitat, this dispersal or immigration filter weeds you out. After you've passed through the dispersal filter, you then have the abiotic filter. And this filter weeds out arriving species unable to cope with the new environment, i.e. changes in pH or temperature. For example, if you are let's say you're the seed of a plant, like a dandelion, and they can be carried by the wind thousands of kilometers. Dandelions grow very well in sort of temperate, wet areas. If a dandelion seed gets blown all the way down to Moab, for example, and it lands in the desert in Moab, yes, it can get through the dispersal filter, but when that seed lands on the dry, hot desert of Moab, the seed doesn't germinate. So as it's been weeded out by the abiotic factors. Even though it was able to arrive in the new location, it wasn't able to cope with environmental conditions. After you've passed through the abiotic filter, you then get to the biotic filter, and this is the interactions among species. So this biotic filter weeds out any species unable to compete or deal with predators or lacking prey or pollinator species. So even if you've arrived in a new location and you can cope with the heat, you can cope with the dryness, if you haven't got any other animals or plants to eat, or there's an animal that's going to eat you very well, you're not going to be able to survive, and you get weeded out by the biotic filter. Any species that can pass through the biotic filter can cope with the other species. It becomes established and forms part of the local community. So what we have is, when we're looking from the regional species pool down to the local community, we have this series of filters that you have to pass through. Say, for example, if we're going from North America down to Logan Canyon. So a new species arrives, let's say, on the East Coast. So it arrives in New York. And we're trying to work out if it's going to get to Logan Canyon. The first question is, can that species make the journey? Can it disperse down into Logan Canyon? If yes, if it manages it to, can it then cope with the relatively hot summers and the relatively cold winters, and can it cope with the altitude and lack of oxygen? If it can, it passes through the abiotic filter. Say it makes it this far, has it now got enough food? Has it got species it can eat? It might be evolved to survive on a species of animal or plant that doesn't exist in Logan Canyon, but if it does, it survives and it becomes established into the local community. So we have this sequential filters concept. The crucial point is you have to pass through each of these filters in turn. Even if you could cope with the abiotic and biotic conditions in a local area, if you cannot disperse there in the first place, you can't become established. Okay. So just a couple of quick questions to make sure we're up to speed. So the area hypothesis states that the tropics should be more diverse because A, the tropics have large land masses, B, the tropics have been stable for a long period, C, the tropics are very productive, D, species in the tropics evolve quickly, E, the land bridge in between North and South America mixed all the species. Just give you 5 seconds on that one. And yeah, the answer is the area hypothesis states tropics should have more diverse because they have large land masses. Although the tropics are more diverse than they have been, it is associated with B and C and even D. That's not the area hypothesis. You have to remember which hypothesis is which. Okay, that's the end of where we wanted to get to today. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.